Okay.
Okay, good. So, first thing I think is that maybe introductions are in order. So, just for our viewers, right? So I'm Brendan Case. I'm a graduate assistant in the Division of Student Affairs at Duke, and I'm also a master's student studying Christian theology at Duke Divinity School. And joining me today is Dr. Paul Griffiths. He holds the Warren Chair in Catholic Theology at Duke Divinity. So, Paul, thanks for chatting with me today.
It's a pleasure.
Good. So, yeah, we should just dive right in. Well, I've informally settled on the title "Religion and the Academy in a Secular Age" as a broad heading for our conversation today. So I thought I would begin with a couple of definitional questions. Mostly given that I've sort of foisted this title on your remarks, I thought I would give you a chance to comment on two of these sort of much contested terms, particularly religion and secular. So first, religion. Basically, what is religion? So first, as a category, is it something natural that we've discovered, or is it something artificial that we've created? And then, as a category, do you find it descriptively helpful, unhelpful, both in making sense of sort of lived faith traditions as you find them on the ground?
Well, those are large questions. I think the category religion is an artifact. We made it up, that is to say, and we made it up for our own purposes. But certainly for Americans, it's not one that we can dispense with because it's in the Constitution. It's First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it's woven deeply into our legal establishment, therefore, and into our politics, and into the fabric of our university life, so we can't dispense with it. But very briefly, its history is that after the Reformation, and even more especially after the turmoils of the 18th century, the category was used as a label for anything that human beings did that seemed to them to have something to do with God. So it's a term derived from an understanding of Christianity. It came to be applied to Jews and then to Muslims and eventually to Hindus and Buddhists and others. So that's effectively what we've got now. And if you ask what the category religion at Duke means, it means all those things. There are representatives of all those traditions actively present at Duke, and that's typically the way in which the category would be understood now.
Good. Okay. So moving on then to the second term, secular, and this is, if anything, more difficult. Just briefly, for you, is it helpful for us to think of ourselves as living in a secular age? And if so, in what sense?
Yeah, I do find that helpful because it's that phrase, secular, that term secular age, has deep Christian roots. So the Latin version of it, saeculum, goes all the way back really to the beginnings of Latin Christianity. So you can see it in Augustine, you can see it in the Church Fathers, and they used it simply to label the history of the cosmos that is separate from or distinct from the history of what God intends for the cosmos. So for them, roughly speaking, to be secular is to belong to the world, but not to belong to God. And that still serves a useful purpose, I think. And more specifically, in terms of recent history, again, for Americans, the idea that there is some distinction, exactly what the distinction is, remains conflicted, that there is some distinction between what goes under the category religion, on the one hand, and what goes under the category politics, on the other hand. Such a distinction is important in some way, and the term secular can be used as a label for the idea that there is such a distinction, that there should be an autonomous sphere of politics, perhaps, and an autonomous sphere of religion, and then the question becomes how to relate them. And that has some uses, and again, it's not something we can dispense with. It's given to us. It's part of the air we breathe.
Good, fair enough. Okay, so this is the second kind of broad category for discussion. Oddly enough, I think, for the holder of a named chair in Catholic theology, your doctorate, assuming you've not secretly acquired a second, your doctorate is not actually in Christian theology at all, but rather, if I can trust your CV, it's in Gupta period Indian Buddhist thought.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So given that an inevitable part of university life is meeting, discussion, argument among smart people who agree on practically nothing about the nature of the world or the meaning of it, just wanted to ask if you would talk a bit about what brought you to study Buddhism, and then maybe about what that study taught you about engaging with traditions quite different from your own, and finally, how your work as a Christian theologian has been informed by your engagement with that tradition.
Yeah, those are good questions and not so easy. First part's easy enough. I began to study Buddhism because I wanted, as a Christian theologian, as a young man, to fully engage a tradition of thought and practice that had arisen quite independently of Christianity, but that was long-lived, widely culturally spread. So there are different kinds of Buddhisms in India, in Japan, in China, in Thailand, and so forth. I wanted to study that, understand it, come to grips with it, to see if I could offer a Christian theological account of what that might be. So that was the motivation. I was very dissatisfied with ordinary Christian analyses of the variety of religions, because very few such analyses actually engaged anything substantive. So I wanted a thick understanding of at least one such tradition. So I spent a long time trying to get that, studying Sanskrit and Tibetan and reading texts and traveling and so forth. And then the question of what the results of doing that were or are, that's much harder to say. I think I learned from Buddhists and from the Buddhist tradition how to be a better Christian theologian. That's to say, I learned from them about attitudes to an authoritative tradition that I had not learned from Christians. And that became very important for me, the idea of a tradition of thought, a tradition of practice as constituting or forming the individual rather than the other way around, rather than the individual choosing it. That became very important to me, and I learned that from Buddhism, I think, much more clearly than I did from Christianity. So that certainly influenced my understanding of Catholic Christianity. It's not that it's not there in the Christian tradition, it's just that I hadn't been able to learn it from Christians, but I did learn it from Buddhists, both text and people. And then there have been more particular results as well, particular topics that I'd studied in Buddhist materials that have, in some cases, dramatic difference from Christian ones, and therefore they raise questions of difference, what to say about real difference, but also questions that have significant overlap. Buddhist analyses, for example, of what constitutes the person, though very different from Christian ones, have interesting overlaps with respect to analyses of what we would call vices and virtues. They have other terms for that. So there's lots of fruitful interconnection in several ways at once.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So we can turn now kind of from the area of learned inquiry to specifically the question of friendship. And so in a lecture some time ago, you offered a really fascinating typology of religious otherness. And so offering this from a Christian standpoint, obviously, and you argued that sort of by reason of our shared history, Christians are intrinsically likely to find Jews to be less other than Buddhists, and in turn more likely to find Buddhists to be less other than, say, atheists. And presumably a Buddhist or an atheist could construct an analogous typology, starting out from their own traditions. Yeah. So you offer this typology as you consider the challenge of befriending a religious other. And so I just want to talk about that for a minute. What are the particular challenges that a Christian, for instance, faces in attempting to befriend an atheist, for instance, or a Buddhist, for instance? And then, given those challenges, what are some constructive ways that a Christian and an atheist might together try to overcome those barriers?
Yeah. Good questions. So a lot depends on how you think about what friendship is in getting at this, I think. And that's, of course, not a straightforward matter. People have different understandings. But the understanding that, on the whole, I prefer, though there are problems with it, is that friendship involves both enough of a community of concern or interest between the friends that thick, rich, ongoing communication is possible. That's to say, you can't really be friends with someone with whom you share no concern. You also can't really be friends with someone with whom you share no space. That is to say, somebody you never see, though you can be in some sense a friend of them. It's a strange sense. Friendship is like parenthood and being a husband or wife. It has an embodied aspect, I think. So you need a certain community of interest and a certain degree of proximity. And so then, with deep religious otherness, there can be real difficulties because community of interest, shared vocabulary and so forth, often is not really there or not there very much, or there are points of tension, conflict, difficulty, and so forth. So there can be difficulties in developing friendship. For Christians, I think, there's a kind of fundamental level of openness to the other, whether religious other or not, that helps with some of this. That is, if we follow the example of Jesus and what the church requires of us, we are supposed to love all others, give ourselves to them, serve them. That's the beginning of friendship in some cases. So that's one aspect of it. But then in the case of particular religious others, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, each of which requires a different account, I think. But in the case of those religious others, there tends to be also a shared concern of two kinds at least. One is that there's a shared concern as to how to maintain identity in the context of political and economic systems that don't have much interest in such identity. So talking to Buddhist friends, for example, Tibetan Buddhists exiled from Tibet by the actions of the People's Republic of China in the late 1950s. One of their driving concerns is how to maintain themselves as representatives of a tradition of Buddhist thought and practice, because there's no political sympathy for that. The economic system doesn't provide much support for it. How then are they going to maintain themselves? There are similar concerns for many Christians, though different in specifics. Similar concerns about how to maintain identity in a largely uncaring or hostile environment. Jews obviously have such concerns. The very survival of the Jewish people has been in question at various points of the 20th century, and so on, a familiar story. So there are commonalities of concern in that way, over against something that is not what one is oneself. But there's also, I think, a commonality of concern, sometimes anyway, with the religious other at least, about questions of meaning and concern about ends. What exactly are we here for? What exactly is it we're supposed to be doing? And those shared concerns can sometimes, again not always, lead to the possibility of shared action. We sometimes want to do things together because we care about the same things. One obvious example, famous at least in Catholic circles, is that in the context of the World Health Organization's various attempts to constrain world population, whatever one thinks about that question, Catholics and Muslims were the principal voices in joint action to resist certain aspects of the WHO's attempt to limit world population growth. So it's not that Catholics and Muslims see eye to eye about everything, but there was a shared concern about some of the programs that were being put in place by Catholics and Muslims, so joint action was possible. So there's those sorts of shared concerns as well, and those can often provide an important framework for friendship, I think, across religious boundaries. So that's at least the beginnings of an answer to a long discussion. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so I've got one more broad heading I want you to comment on. And so this is springing out of a lecture you gave again some time ago with the really delightfully provocative title, Why Theology Should Find the Public Academy Inhospitable.
Right.
So really, with no further ado, could you just give us the short version of why that's so? and this is the matter of real concern. If that's the case, this sort of proper expectation of inhospitality. Comment a bit on how that might shape the intellectual life of, say, a student at this university.
Right.
I mean, ideal typically maybe a Christian, but analogously a Jew or Muslim or Buddhist who takes the intellectual claims of her faith seriously, but at the same time is reckoning with the claims of whatever she's specializing in, economics, chemistry.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this is a question for every serious Christian or Jew or Muslim at a great university like Duke. So, what's the inhospitable part? Well, I mean, I meant that lecture as a provocation, so I'll be provocative now too, but it's essentially this. Christianity certainly, and the other traditions in their own ways also, but Christianity certainly is in its own self-understanding both comprehensive, that's to say nothing falls outside its purview, and evangelical, that is to say it would like others to adopt itself. It would like others to enter into Christianity and to adopt Christian ways of thought, speech, and action. Now those two things, offering a comprehensive explanation and being evangelical, are not part of the ethos or the DNA of a contemporary Research One university in the United States of America in 2011. So when those aspects of the tradition come to the surface, which they often do, they create tension. A couple of examples. It belongs properly to theology as an intellectual discipline, I think, and the Catholic tradition thinks, I speak here for it, to want to offer an account of how the various particular disciplines that constitute human intellectual life are related to one another and what they conjointly mean. A traditional way of putting this is to say that theology is queen of the disciplines. That's a strange metaphor, but you get the idea. Monarch, we might now better say. But now this doesn't have much purchase in a contemporary university. If theologians start going around and explaining to biologists and chemists and scholars of literature and historians how what they do fits together, and even what they do is, the response will be puzzlement, derision, or perhaps sometimes hostility. So that's as it should be, I think. That's to say that sort of tension is inevitable and proper given the university's self-understanding and theology's self-understanding. So that's one instance of what I mean. There's also the evangelical problem. It's certainly the case that universities provide hospitality to overtly evangelical groups. Campus Crusade for Christ and the Catholic Church, to take a Protestant and a Catholic example, are actively supported in various ways by Duke University. But there are limits beyond which that simply will not go. So that if, for example, evangelical Protestants want to be out there trying to convert Orthodox Jews or faithful Muslims or the like and become obnoxious in doing so, according to the university's understanding, there'll be a problem. If I, as a teacher, spend time in the classroom trying to make people who aren't Catholic, there'll be a problem. And again, these I think are proper tensions because according to the university's self-understanding, there should be a problem, and according to the church's understanding, there should be a problem. So that it's a real and I think creative tension. So with all that said, that's the inhospitable part. But there's another side to it too, and it's this. According to at least Catholic Christian self-understanding, we Catholic Christians should expect pagan intellectuals, that is to say intellectuals who have no interest in Christianity one way or the other, or Judaism or Islam either, we should expect their intellectual enterprises to be productive of truth, to be worth observing and participating in, and therefore to be capable of instructing the church. We'd expect that too. So from a Christian point of view, all that has to be held together. So a faithful Catholic student, whether at the Divinity School or an undergraduate, ought to be supported by the church in her intellectual enterprises. Just so long as, however, those enterprises don't themselves become claimants to universality, evangelical, and so forth. When they do, the tensions I mentioned will come to the surface. So it's a complicated picture. And I don't myself think that there's any reasonable chance that theology is going to be recognized as Queen of the Sciences at Duke University. This is not something I hold my breath about, even though I think it's true that in fact it is. So that provides an agreeably complicated mode of being for somebody like me, whose entire life has been almost in European and American universities. I must say it's a tension I like. It's not one that I don't like. So.
Wonderful. Well, that gives us plenty to think about. So we can conclude the interview there.
Thank you.